This video will concern an article in which Leif Wenar argues in defense of a policy that he claims will promote international justice. That policy is to quit robbing the people who live in the most oppressed parts of the world. Assume that an armed group of pirates take control of a cargo ship at sea. After taking over the cargo ship, they start breaking into the containers and auctioning off whatever they find inside. Buyers show up in helicopters, take the merchandise they paid for, and fly off. Wenar asks whether the pirates own the material that they're selling, whether they have a right to sell the products or to keep the money that they collect from those sales. More importantly, Wenar asks whether the buyers, who know the full story of how the pirates got control of the ship and who the merchandise belongs to, owns any of the material they buy. Wenar argues that the answer is no, in both cases. So what does this have to do with international justice? Well, assume that an armed group takes over a country. After taking over the country, they start selling off the country's natural resources, diamonds, oil, anything the country has of value that can be sold. One of the resources that these autocratic dictators often sell off is the future labor of the population. This happens when some institution lends money to such a government. The promise to pay back the loans is often a promise to tax or otherwise extract the wealth from the future population. Does the warlord acquire a legitimate right to sell off these resources? That's the same question, according to Wenar, as to whether the pirates have the right to sell off the material in the containers on the ship they hijack. More importantly, do the buyers, who are well aware of what's happened in that country, become the rightful owners of that property? Or are they guilty of knowingly receiving stolen goods? If the answer is no, then a large portion of many of the goods owned by people in developed countries is stolen goods. And now that you've gotten this far in the video, owning these products involves knowingly receiving stolen goods. Wenar uses as an example Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guyana. Obiang claims to be in constant communication with God, and that God has granted him the right to kill without penalty in this life or the next. He acquires much of the money he uses to stay in power by selling the country's oil. Very little of that money goes to the population. The principle that Wenar draws upon states that the resources of a territory are owned by its people. Consequently, nothing can be legitimately done to those resources without their consent. He further argues that the principles that he seeks to draw upon are already written into international law. Wenar writes, quote, "A fundamental principle governing the sale of property states that in order to complete a valid sale, a vendor must have the right to sell. The thief has no title to the watch he has stolen from your nightstand, and so cannot pass title to the watch to any buyer, however willing." He then goes on to argue that the autocratic dictator of a country that doesn't govern from the consent of the people does not have title to that country's resources, and so can't legitimately pass title on to others. To show that this principle already exists in international law, he cites the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, quote, 1. All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. 2. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources. End quote. To clarify the argument, Wenar includes in a footnote the statement that in international law, the phrase "a people" refers to all of the citizens of a country. It also says in Article 47 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, quote, "Nothing in the present covenant shall be interpreted as impairing the inherent right of all peoples to enjoy and utilize fully and freely their natural wealth and resources." End quote. He also cites Article 21 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Quote, "All people shall freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources. This right shall be exercised in the exclusive interest of the people. In no case shall a people be deprived of it." End quote. If we accept this premise that the people have a right to the resources, Wenar then goes on to argue that their consent is required for any use or sale of those resources. If I own some property, say a field out in the country, I don't give my consent to the use of that property unless certain conditions are met. Weiner writes, quote, for an owner to be able to authorize sales, the owner must at least 1. Be able to find out about the sales, 2. Be able to stop the sales without incurring severe costs, and 3. Not be subject to extreme manipulation by the seller. End quote. According to Weiner, where these conditions are not met, the natural resources are being stolen. For the next step in his argument, Weiner is looking for a test to determine if the people in a country are consenting to the sale of those resources. For his test, he argues that if a country has a Freedom House rating of 7, then the necessary conditions for consent haven't been met, and the resources are being stolen from the people. Freedom House is a nonprofit organization that assesses the level of political and cultural freedom in a country. At the time Weiner was writing, a score of 7 was the lowest score that a country could have. Freedom House now uses a scale from 1 to 100, with a higher number representing more political freedom. On that scale, Equatorial Guyana still has a score of 5 out of 100. If you're interested, as of the time of this writing, July 2023, the least free countries are listed here. These are the countries where the regime in power has no legitimate authority to sell the country's natural resources, according to Weiner. This applies to oil, diamonds, copper, lumber, whatever, including the future labor of the population. On the question of whether the purchaser can become the rightful owner of stolen property, Weiner looks at the issue of what's called a good faith or a bona fide purchaser. A good faith purchaser is one who buys without notice of circumstances that would make a person of ordinary prudence inquire whether the vendor's title to the goods being sold was valid. End quote. Weiner argues that these conditions have not been met in the circumstances he is concerned with. So what does Weiner propose that we do about this? He suggests the following. 1. For the governments to prohibit the purchase of natural resources that do not meet the criteria for the people's consent. Another is to impose taxes on products made using those resources to the point of recovering the money, with a promise to pay it to the country once the people again control their natural resources. This represents one way of establishing global economic justice. It doesn't call for massive economic redistribution of wealth or population control. According to Weiner, it involves simply enforcing the international law that is already on the books governing who may legitimately sell property. If we enforce the right of the people in each country to have a share of the value of the natural resources of their country, there would be less global poverty.